Hi everyone, and welcome to the third episode of Japanese Phonetics by Dogen. In this episode, I will be discussing two misconceptions you're likely to run into while studying Japanese pitch accent. For the sake of argument, I will be using the terms pitch accent and intonation interchangeably here to very simply describe the high and low sounds of individual words. Towards the middle of this lesson, we'll be introducing some slightly complicated terms as well, but don't worry too much if it seems a bit overwhelming. The purpose of this lesson is to illustrate what we should be aware of as Japanese learners, not define the terms that we use to describe Japanese phonetics from this point forward. Detailed terminology and the fundamentals of Japanese pitch accent will be covered in lessons 5 and 6. Myth number 1. Japanese intonation is flat. Japanese intonation is flat, so it's not important to study Japanese intonation. Only pronunciation matters. There are typically two contexts in which this myth occurs. The first being Japanese as an East Asian language, and the second being Japanese as perceived by native Japanese speakers and teachers who don't fully understand Japanese pitch accent or intonation. Let's address both. Context 1. Japanese as an East Asian language. You probably know where this is going, but I'd still like to spend a little bit of time addressing the issue. Oral languages are often divided into tonal languages and non-tonal languages. In tonal languages, different tones like ah, are used to distinguish meaning between otherwise phonetically identical words. Many East Asian languages, such as Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese, and Thai, are tonal. Japanese is not a tonal language. Sometimes people mistakenly interpret this to mean that Japanese intonation, or pitch accent, is flat and that you only need to worry about pronunciation. This is false because while Japanese words don't have the type of tonal patterns that exist in Mandarin or Vietnamese, they do have distinct pitch accent patterns. You can think of it sort of like this. English is not a tonal language, but English words have accents. When the accent is placed on the wrong syllable, as in syllable or syllable, it sounds unnatural. Japanese is similar. There aren't tones like ah or ah, but when the pitch accent of a word is off, it sounds strange. Thus, it's misleading to say that Japanese intonation is flat just because Japanese is not a tonal language. A lack of tones does not necessarily equate to an acoustically flat phonetic system or intonation system. It's also critically important to emphasize that just because Japanese and English are both non-tonal doesn't mean they share the same set of rules when it comes to linguistics, and phonetics in particular. The truth is quite the opposite. While English words are typically characterized by a single accent, as in university or the adopted karaoke, many Japanese words have multiple high-pitch moras or syllables, as in daigaku or karaoke. It's necessary, therefore, for aspiring Japanese learners to push beyond the very oversimplified tonal or non-tonal binary classification terms. Rather than thinking about tonal or non-tonal as two sides of a coin, maybe try and think about tonal or non-tonal as the even and odd numbers of a game die. 1 and 5 are both odd numbers, and yet completely different. In the same way, Japanese and English are both in the non-tonal family, and yet completely different. In summary, 1, Japanese is not a tonal language like Mandarin, but it does have a dynamic intonation or pitch accent system. And 2, though English and Japanese are both non-tonal languages, their intonation or accent systems are very different. Context 2. Japanese as perceived by native Japanese speakers and teachers who don't fully understand Japanese pitch accent. This one is a bit tricky, but again, don't worry too much about the terminology. For the time being, try and focus on the overall argument. One of the more common pitch accent patterns in Japanese, which I'll be addressing in detail very soon, is known as the Heibang pattern. This roughly translates to flat board, or flat as in monotonous or without change. You would assume then that words in the Heibang pattern or group have flat intonation or pitch accent. This isn't the case. Ore as in I and iku as in go are both Heibang words which, as you probably noticed, have rising pitch accent patterns. The thing they don't have, however, is the dramatic downstep, which is the accent in Japanese. Again, this will all be addressed in an upcoming lesson. The takeaway point here is that while it's accurate to say that Heibang words don't have a prominent accent, they do have a low to high pitch change, which is why it's dangerous to describe this pattern to non-native speakers simply as flat. This often happens, though, due to the pattern's name, as well as how Japanese native speakers versus linguists or non-native speakers unconsciously perceive these words, especially when the words are long. The real elephant in the room, however, is the fact that Heibang isn't the only pitch accent pattern in Japanese, and that the other patterns have both changes in pitch and a prominent accent. Examples include taberu, as in eat, or hashiru, as in run, or aisatsu, as in greetings. These words should not be said with a flat intonation. Why then would Japanese teachers, sometimes native speakers of the language, tell their students that Japanese is a flat language? Well, this is because Japanese teachers want their students to stop using a small selection of pitch accent patterns for all Japanese words. Here's what I mean. Even without phonetic training, most native English speakers can hear and mimic some, but not all, of the various pitch accent patterns that exist in Japanese. For example, it's relatively easy for an English native speaker to hear and mimic the pitch accent pattern from aisatsu, because its pitch accent pattern is very similar, though not identical, to that of many English words. Aisatsu sounds a bit like dictionary. So when Japanese learners hear words like aisatsu, they unconsciously assume that Japanese words and English words have somewhat similar pitch accent or intonation patterns. Their brain tells them this pattern definitely exists in Japanese. I've verified it. The problem is, however, that there are many pitch accent patterns that native English speakers can't typically hear or mimic without some form of phonetic training. Heibang is one of these patterns. So what does the native English speaker do? Well, they map the patterns that they can hear and mimic, such as those from aisatsu or taberu, onto all Japanese words. This results in gakko or ginko or koban rather than gakko, ginko, koban. So when a Japanese learner says gakusei instead of gakusei, their teacher often corrects them by saying there is no accent on that word because, as I just explained, though there are changes in pitch, there is no accent on this word. This leads to the no accent? Yes, no accent. Say it in a flat manner. A flat manner? Yes, Japanese intonation is flat. Conversation. Japanese teachers, native or not, don't usually have a readily available tool set to clearly explain Japanese pitch accent. So when their students say Heibang words with the wrong pitch accent, Japanese teachers will often do the only thing they know how to. They say Japanese is flat because Heibang is one of the more common pitch accent patterns in Japanese, and they want their students to stop stressing the first or second syllable in almost every other word. Thus, it's wrong to say that Japanese intonation is flat, but easy to understand why this misconception exists. It's important for us as non-native Japanese speakers to realize that this misconception, while helpful to a certain degree, is, again, an overgeneralization that ultimately limits our phonetic abilities. Please note that say it flat is also sometimes said with regards to entire statements or sentences, rather than individual words. That being said, I personally believe that the root of the over-accented Japanese, even at the sentence level, stems primarily from the aforementioned reasons. And I'll be talking about this in detail in later lessons. Myth number 2. Different Japanese dialects have different intonation patterns, so it's not necessary or important to study Japanese intonation. Even Japanese people say the same word with different intonation patterns depending on the region that they're from. So it's not important that I study Japanese intonation. There's truth to this statement in the sense that you don't have to have correct standard Japanese in order to be completely understandable. It's also true that intonation or pitch accent patterns vary greatly depending on the dialect. However, the thing that most people who make this argument usually fail to realize is that native speakers who speak with a unique dialect do so with consistency. In other words, a Japanese person speaking in Fukuoka dialect won't arbitrarily, emphasis on arbitrarily, switch into Kansai dialect and then into Tokyo dialect in the middle of a statement or sentence. Because Japanese natives speak with phonetic and semantic consistency, there is never a disconnect from a lack of incongruity. Non-native speakers who don't study pitch accent, on the other hand, often map the pitch accent patterns of their native language onto Japanese, making some words sound like Tokyo dialect, some words sound like Kansai dialect, etc., etc. So different dialects of Japanese do have different intonation patterns. But until your pitch accent patterns are unified into a single set, it will sound unnatural to a certain degree. This is why I typically encourage students to study standard Japanese and to study abroad in a region that uses standard Japanese, if their end goal is developing a native-like accent. Studying standard Japanese in the classroom in a different dialect outside of the classroom isn't productive for students who are looking to memorize a complete set of phonetic patterns. Granted, it can be very interesting. I should also mention that while there are accentless dialects in Japanese, it's incorrect to assume that using flat intonation alone is enough to make it sound like you're speaking such a dialect correctly. Dialect is more than unique intonation, or lack thereof. It's also unique words, conjugations, mannerisms, etc. It would be quite rash to try and speak in a certain dialect without knowing about the region it's from, or how the dialect sounds to the average Japanese native speaker. Trying to take a phonetic shortcut by saying everything in an acoustically flat manner might immediately improve your spoken Japanese, but at the same time, it might also make you sound like a mushroom farmer. If your end goal is developing an impressive, universally understandable accent, I recommend standard Japanese. This is because 1, you're probably already studying it, 2, because it is highly documented, and 3, because there are no surprises. With standard Japanese, what you hear is what you get. That being said, if there is a particular dialect of Japanese that you're fond of or feel a deep connection with, I won't try and dissuade you from pursuing phonetic mastery of that dialect. Just know that researching that dialect may be difficult due to a lack of documentation, and that until you reach a very advanced level in that dialect, there is a probability that your pitch accent will sound somewhat fragmented. This is all subjective though. Some people, for example, might prefer to speak in a slightly fragmented manner if it means that they can be more involved with the community that speaks that dialect. It's all about trade-offs. Okay guys, that's all for this lesson. Just to clarify, this will be the last Japanese phonetics lesson that I post in its entirety to YouTube. Lessons 4 and beyond will be exclusive content on Patreon for supporters in the $10 a month price tier. All of Japanese phonetics essential content will be finished within approximately 5 to 6 months, so patrons who sign up now will pay about $50 to $60, or just over the price of a new Genki textbook for the bulk of the series content. If you're looking to save money, you can wait a month or two and sign up after more content has already been uploaded. That being said, the more patrons I have, the faster I can push content out, so I think we may be playing off of each other a little bit for the foreseeable future. In Lesson 4, I will be covering phonetic awareness and useful phonetic practices, And in Lesson 5, I will begin to introduce the basics of Japanese intonation, or pitch accent. The various free third-party tools you can use to supplement your phonetic studies will come slightly after that. Thank you for your continued support, and see you again soon.